I just decided to focus on some main concepts, four main concepts of that. Many of them agree with the details and bring together the details that Step showed, except that I do take a slightly different focus in that I am looking specifically at on-farm experimentation. Now, there we go. So quick outline, four main points I want to make. First of all, I just want to try and stress why it is important to consider the value. I want to just ponder where the value comes from and get some clarity on that, because it's not straightforward. Thirdly, I just want to talk about the importance of not just creating value, but working out how to share it, so to lead towards the minimum viable product that Christian and Step were talking about. And finally, I'll finish up with some main reasons why failure can occur, what can go wrong. So here we go. First point is why it's important to consider what value is in the OFE process. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of a highly participatory project that was being conducted, I think, in Syria at that time. Very interesting. There was a lot of interaction between researchers and farmers, but what it transpired that what the farmers were interested in was completely not what the researchers thought they were interested in. And they went through the whole process, and it gets to the point that Step made, that you need to start with the farmer, not just arrive in their life and try and change things subsequently. The thing has to be farmer-centric. Now, farmers are natural experimenters. Virtually all the farmers I've met experiment as a means of learning, virtually all. And I think yesterday Nicholas put the figure up of 80% of their farmers experiment, and we found, Murdoch found that over 90% of ours experiment. They all like experimenting. But to enter a process of on-farm experimentation actually requires time, can require some money, and also it may actually cost or threaten the credibility of the farmer. So the question is, where's that value going to come from, and to whom does the value actually accrue? Farmers should be at the center of the on-farm experimentation process, but it's not the farmers only. So some idea has to be considered early on as to what kind of information trading is going to occur to keep the process viable and sustain it through many stages. The third point I want to make quickly here is that value does take different forms. We tend to consider evaluating these kind of processes in purely financial or economic terms, but in actual fact, many of the experiments and the value from experiments comes from doing things better, which actually is a major issue of credibility to the farmers and the idea of social capital building, not just financial, and it's not even just time management. Second point I want to make is consider where the value actually comes from. Well, I would say that the value actually doesn't come from the data or the analysis, even though that's where we spent most of our efforts so far trying to improve, that is necessary. But I'd say it actually comes from knowledge, and it comes from knowing what works on my farm and under my conditions, and also why I believe the result of that experiment. So that's a much broader development of knowledge than just doing the analysis. And it's also much broader than individual decisions, because it's enabling, the results enable farmers to evaluate results or insights from many different sources. This knowledge actually comes from three sources. The first, and as I said, that we tend to focus on are the data sciences. That's pretty important, and in our perspective, that's very important because we have very large data sets. And so the data science enables you to get insight from quite complex observations. But there are two other spheres that are really important. One is the social sciences. It's very important to provide frameworks to evaluate the insight within the massive structural and translational uncertainties that Step mentioned. And the third one that we tend to overlook quite often, almost completely, is that the agricultural science itself is important to provide background information, background insight to help evaluate what's going to happen to those results over time in different places, and whether you actually believe the results is just a result for that one experiment, or if it actually represents some much bigger fundamental process that's very important. And in all this work, actually crossing disciplines can be extremely difficult, but very, very important to realize the full value. In other words, analysis on its own, without knowing the social or biological context, is unlikely to develop sustainable long-term processes. So just a quick picture on the right of a large experiment that was actually put in by the farmer. The analysis provided insight to the farmer of what the results were actually telling him. Some interpretation of that in terms of profitability and viability in the longer term helped farmer evaluate results a bit more. But what was not really pursued, but what could be pursued, is that the agronomy, an analysis of the agronomy and understanding from an agronomic perspective could help understand where the results worked and where they did not work, and then scale out the results and the insight from this experiment over much wider areas. Third point I want to make is about creating and sharing value. Now, somebody within this process actually needs to capture value to support the OFE process. Somebody needs to do it. So the process should be built around farmers, but people need to be involved to actually make the process work and to scale it up. And so organization is needed to support this scaling process and make it transparent and to maintain social capital on which you can scale. So here on the right-hand side, I just adopted a very, very simple approach that is widely used about developing business models to try and get a range of different people involved in a process. We've applied these to different types of on-farm experimentation activities, and they all kind of differ. But the thing that strikes me about this is that the range of people who need to be involved in a process for it to be scalable and for it to thrive and sustain itself. The other thing is that there are a number of different types of business model that you can consider. They might be from the service provider perspective. So, for example, the on 1 acre farm approach that Sepp talked about, essentially they're providing a service, and the process of on-farm experimentation needs to be delivered by that service provider and generate value with their key clients, the farmers. But there are alternatives to that kind of model. There might be, in actual fact, product support. It might be a supplier who wants to demonstrate the credibility of their product with their chief clients, or even it might come down to asset valuation. I have discussed those models with people here who might use experimentation to demonstrate through performance characteristics why their land should be upgraded in value or downgraded. So a range of different types there. The fourth thing I wanted to touch on was the failure. What can go wrong? And I used the figure on the right-hand side, thanks to Rob Bramley for that, for our very early venture into on-farm experimentation, to try and illustrate this. The first cause of failure can be user failure. That is, the client just isn't interested, or that they don't see enough coming out of this process for them to benefit from it. Now, I'd say that's not common. In our case, it didn't kind of apply. The farmers were very interested in performing on-farm experimentation, and this goes back to the 90s, and they could always think of things they'd like to explore. So what are the other sources of failure? Well, the other main one would be technical failure, and that's why I put this image on there, is that at the time, it was a highly advanced approach to using precision agriculture technology and variable rate technology to install a whole field experiment of 72 hectares, in fact, using nitrogen. And that seemed far too advanced for many of our science colleagues, but in actual fact, the farmers and some of the consultants got it straight away. They understood it, but it's still an issue about how or where you're going to be able to acquire data that is usable. It's still an issue, but much less so. I'd say the third case is by far the largest one, and that's what I'd call a process failure, either where the customer isn't served because hadn't listened to them and we hadn't responded, and we didn't engage that process of customer value and creation that Seth mentioned. It could be that the processing costs are just too great, and this is something that we found was an issue, that it can cost quite a lot of time and money to actually develop data processing techniques. It could be that the process is too difficult or too technical, and so it just isn't able to deliver results that are relevant to farmers when they want them to. It could be that we haven't bothered identifying the value to work out how farmers or consultants or others can use the results. Or it could be just that organization isn't possible to enable scaling in the process to occur. In actual fact, in my view, this one tends to be the prevailing reason for value failure. So in summary, just wanted to make 4 points, just touch on those again. The first is that I think identifying the value is key to the process. It's the driver, and if you don't understand or people don't appreciate where it's coming from, then OFE isn't going to work. The point I want to make about creation through knowledge is that it's a surprisingly complex process that takes a lot of time to work out what farmers are going to use and to develop knowledge products that they're going to be able to use. The value must be created and shared to develop business models and critical organization to make the process work, and that failure can and has occurred. But I'd say it's mainly through our inability to organize sufficiently around farmers for them to actually capture that value. It's there. I would like to make one final point though. If you think about it, what is the most sustainable value that's going to come from this and other data-rich process? It's actually the value created from knowledge, which is effectively an infinitely creatable resource and will actually support sustainable growth for all farming systems throughout the world. So on that quick note, I'd like to thank you very much. Mail contact if you want to follow up there, and hand you back now to Isabel. Thank you, Isabel.